Hi everyone and welcome to this new video case study. My name is Emmanuel, I'm a developer relation engineer at Liveblocks. Here I am today with Steve Ruiz, founder of Tldraw. Hi Steve, how are you?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Can you introduce yourself in a few words, please?
Yeah, I'm Steve. I'm a designer, developer living in London, and I've been working with kind of open source, infinite canvas type of apps, including Tldraw.
Great. So, can you tell us more about Tldraw?
Sure. Uh, so this is a product. It's available at Tldraw.com. Um, it's kind of two things. It's one is a whiteboarding application, multiplayer whiteboarding application, diagramming tool, but it's also kind of meant to be a step towards providing infrastructure for other teams that want to put this type of canvas experience or diagramming infinite canvas experience inside of their own app, or building products that like include infinite canvas type of experiences inside of them.
So let's talk about what you did with Liveblocks for Tldraw. Why did you choose Liveblocks?
Yeah, so I had done a kind of a pretty broad search when it came to multiplayer for Tldraw, to try and find technology that we could use and implement that was fairly lightweight in terms of how it affected the rest of the code base. Again, Tldraw is kind of it's meant to be something that is embedded inside of other applications, so it's not just its own single app, and that meant that we couldn't build the Tldraw like very close knit into like a multiplayer solution. So it's not like we could use data structures that were all built into like a CRDT implementation. We needed it. We needed other people to be able to use their own multiplayer solution with Tldraw, um, and so Liveblocks really stood out to me as something where um, like, yes, if we were building an app, we could just use Liveblocks and integrate with it very tightly. But it also worked for us where that coupling was much looser and where we could sort of um, let Liveblocks drive our multiplayer documents while also making the application itself open to other multiplayer implementations from other people. Um, and yeah, it's worked great.
Thank you. So, if I understand, you tried other collaborative solution. Did you tried some open source solutions?
Sure, yeah. Um, for example, like YJS is a big one. CRDTs, data structures for that, um, and uh, that was another case where and other people have made YJS implementations on top of Tldraw, so it could be possible. It could be done. Um, I felt like the implementation for YJS. Well, two things. One, that the data structure sort of wanted to be the how do I say that the integration was a little too tight for what
Okay.
we were building, and two is that some of the features around YJS are built more with text editors in mind, and we were building, I mean, Tldraw is like a diagramming, infinite canvas app, so there are certain things that are just different about how those type of applications work. I'll give you an example: is like undo and redo.
Yes.
In a text editor, you're typing, and then anytime you kind of like pause just a little bit, it'll make a kind of a commit into the history, so that when you undo, you kind of go back to where you were when you paused. Um, you don't want to have undo go back too far and take out the entire paragraph, but you also definitely don't want to go back character by character. So hello, and then undo back to hell, and then hell, and then he, and then h. Um, I mean, one of the things that I kind of begged for from the Liveblocks team had to do with this. I'm like, in my application, if you grab something and you start dragging it, right, and then you stop dragging it, you would want it to just undo back to where it was when you started dragging it, and ignore all the things that happened in between that interaction. So it's more of like a state-based, like state machine-based undo redo.
Yeah.
Essentially, I would want to like pause the undo history until I was done, and then like unpause it and make that commit over here. And that's something that we can do with Liveblocks. I'm not sure how much influence I had, but it is something that they were able to build, and so that was perfect for us.
You influenced the team, I think, in a good way.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, politely, I hope.
So at first, I think Tldraw was not multiplayer, right? It was meant to be a solo tool, I think. And how easy was it to make it multiplayer?
Yeah, I'd always had multiplayer in mind, but I just hadn't picked an implementation for it. And yeah, it was fairly easy to integrate Liveblocks. The Liveblocks does the hard part about multiplayer, in addition just to pushing out data to all the different clients, is conflict resolution, yes. Right? So if I move a box and then I undo that change, and then someone else deletes that box, and then I redo the change, it would be trying to move something that no longer exists, and that needs to be resolved. And that's something that Liveblocks does. But there's also a little bit of conflict resolution that also has to happen on the client. So inside of the application itself, like if I'm dragging something and someone else moves that thing, do I steal it from the user as they're dragging it and put it where someone else moved it, or do I ignore that and then wait until the person stops dragging? That'll get committed and that'll overwrite the position. And so the hardest part, I suppose, was doing the type of conflict resolution on my side. That would probably, by the way, be much easier if, again, this was just one application and Liveblocks was we were using that in a much tighter way. But it's, I think with any implementation, any multiplayer solution, there's always a little bit of client-side conflict resolution. Just to make the user experience as good as possible.
Great. So can you tell us more about your architecture, software architecture?
Yeah, so Tldraw has a few layers. There's first off, I should say that currently Tldraw is it's an infinite canvas that renders in React. So rather than using HTML canvas and essentially painting pictures, painting images, we use HTML and CSS by way of React. And believe it or not, it works. So there's a couple of different layers there. There's a core rendering solution where you just say, okay, here are the shapes that I have, and here's the data model, and use those shapes to interpret the data model. So if there's a box in the data model, use the box shape description in order to know how should I render this thing, or even how big is it, or whatever. And that's the core part of the architecture. Anyone can build on top of that. Tldraw is also built on top of that. So Tldraw /Tldraw is built on top of Tldraw/core, and then that contains the bulk of the logic around selection, around the different tools, and how you create those shapes. And then there's the website, which embeds Tldraw/Tldraw, but then again, we also distribute Tldraw/Tldraw as a component that anyone could embed in any React app. And hopefully it's all open source, every level that I've just described. So someone else who might want to embed Tldraw could look at our implementation and then see how it's done and either copy and paste that or build based
That's
on it.
great. So what do you think about Liveblocks performances regarding the application you are developing? Did it add a specific impact?
Liveblocks is kind of two layers, right? Two different kind of data transport layers. One is the presence API, which we can use for things like cursors. I know that you know.
Yes.
Cursor, and then the other is the storage API, which we use to kind of like persist the model and send out the changes to the different clients that are connected. The persistence API is we're using that for things like cursors, what people have selected, and then like who's connected and who's not connected. And the storage API is essentially every time that we make a commit to the document, we push that up to the storage API. So every time you do something that is undoable, we push that up to the API or to the storage layer. One thing that we don't do in that case is currently is like capture all the changes that happen that are more transient. So I talked about before about, I grab a shape and I drag it and I move it around and then I stop dragging it. The client, the person dragging that would see it move around, right, as you're dragging. But because we wouldn't send the change until you stopped dragging, someone else would just see it kind of jump from here to here, right? And that's something that we've wanted to improve in the future. But it's also an interesting problem because again, like part of what Liveblocks does is it resolves conflicts that might occur. And as you're dragging something, it's impossible for any conflict really to occur while you're still dragging it. So it's not sure whether we push that information across on the same channel as like the presence layer, so the same as like the cursors, or whether we make those 10,000 commits to the storage layer. And so that's that's kind of like a part of this type of application that you might not have in a different application, but it is a trickier one.
Thank you. Yeah. So, do you store data on Liveblocks storage? Because we have some users that are using the storage as our main database. Do you persist data or do you clean them after a while?
Currently, we persist it. I mean, I've always kind of described our multiplayer as more of like a proof of concept, or arguably the whole project as it is right now is sort of like a glorified prototype of how you might use Tldraw, or how you might use Tldraw, I suppose. I think long term our plan is to persist it onto our own database, but so far everything just stays on Liveblocks, and that's been fine.
Did you have the time or the opportunity to measure what is the impact of Liveblocks on your customers or future business?
I mean, it's interesting. Our analytics kind of suggest that a lot of, especially like the kind of the regional analytics of like where people are using this, because you can kind of tell that like, there's a classroom in Taiwan is using Tldraw because suddenly there's 10 people in Taiwan at the same time on the same page, and that's great to see. I think the Tldraw's ability to kind of spread virally, it's kind of exists a lot just because of the multiplayer. Being able to there's no login, there's no nothing. You just share a link, right? Like Tldraw.com/r will generate a URL with like a unique ID, and you just share that URL with someone else, and now suddenly you're in the same document. And that kind of part of the product of being like an instant
Mm-hmm.
collaborative experience or like an instant whiteboard um, is, yeah, it makes a big difference in terms of how people are introduced to the product and how it spreads in terms of use.
I know that you worked closely with the Liveblocks team for about several weeks then. What was your experiences interacting with the team?
Yeah, our interactions were great. They were super supportive of what I was building, but also of like, again, the kind of like particular requirements of this type of an application. So we
Yeah,
talked about like undo redo and how that's different for us versus like a text editor. And so yeah, they were a joy to work with.
great. I will tell him. So, do you have any feedbacks or feature requests that you want to be implemented inside of Liveblocks?
Hmm. Let me think about that for a moment. I think the biggest, well, there were two things. One is that it was a little tricky to tell um, uh, whether a change to the document was caused by a particular client. So, for example, if someone was typing in a text field, right, and if we were sending those commits on every
Yeah.
every keystroke, so hello is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then what might happen is the we would say, hey, the user has changed the text in this element from HE to HEL. We'd send that off, and then the document would update and say, hey, that element has now it has HEL in it. But meanwhile, the user was still typing, and so we might. It was very difficult for us to know whether that change that had occurred to the document was prompted by the client and whether we had to update the client based on that, or whether we should ignore it because the document essentially like is already as in sync as possible with that document, which is complex because of course sometimes the client, I don't know, could be typing in something that had been deleted and we would want to change the client or something like that. But a lot of those moments of like where we have to do conflict resolution on the client would probably be easier if we knew like who was responsible for this change to begin with, or like is this a change the result of a resolved conflict, or whether this is just like, oh yeah, this was fine. So those types of features.
Who created the change? You mean?
A little bit of context, yeah, like the you know, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe who created this change or who was responsible for it. Did this change involve like resolving a conflict or not? Or yeah, essentially all the information that maybe would make it easier for an application like mine to resolve
Yeah.
things on the client.
So
To make
adding
sure that,
metadatas, I
yeah,
think.
I think so. I'm not even
But
sure what that would look
it's
like, but
interesting.
something.
It's really interesting. So
Yeah.
I'll share that with the team. Thank you again for your time, Steve. You gave us very useful insight about what you are doing with Liveblocks inside of Tldraw. I hope you like this video and I'll see you on the next time. Bye, Steve.
Take care.